Why, unfortunately? Because of the price you had to pay for it?
Yeah, the price is I can't take a walk, I can't do the swim, I can't do the things that I used to love. So, I'm kind of, I'm functional. I can walk around the house, but I can't take a hike, and I can't do my long distance swimming or my mountain biking or anything like that. So I pay the price, but I'm alive.
Yeah, and it was so interesting it was in the aftermath of that devastating experience that you decided to turn particularly to the sublime.
Yeah. Well, it's because I've been wanting to write the book for a long time, and I knew that it has to do a little bit with the feeling of death, and
I don't understand that. So why that? Why make that as? I'm not disputing it. I don't. Yeah. I just don't understand. You talked also about 50 Cent's brush with death. Yeah. Why does the sublime, in your estimation, why is it tangled up with the idea of death?
Well, because there's a limit, that limit, and experiencing the limit gives you that sense of excitement and fear at the same time. Well, death is the ultimate limit. And to have gone up to that door and glimpsed to the other side and literally felt it in your bones and literally feel your bones melting away as you kind of go into a coma, is like I went up to that door. I actually peered inside of it. Now, other people have had much stronger near-death experiences. Mine was more of the milder sort, but still, I peered in.
As far as near-death experiences go, it's relatively mine.
Well, my coma lasted an hour or something. Some people get up there.
That's nothing, man. Experts, they have comas for like 3 years.
Well, okay, all right. I could have had a more intense near-death experience, but it was pretty intense.
Yeah, it sounds like it was sufficient.
It is, but so the sense of life is almost too much. It's overpowering in its immediacy, and we humans try and kind of dull the razor edge so much so that we can live. But if you think about your mortality on a day-to-day basis, and if you try and actually experience the immediacy of life and how dangerous it actually is, and how it's fraught with all of these things that you don't want to confront, is very, very, very powerful. And I'm sorry, Siri just keeps hearing me. I'm so annoying. So it creates. So when you have that, it's like the ultimate. It's a mix of they call in French the orgasm le petit mort, right? So an orgasm is almost like a little death. So that sense of it's almost too much, it's almost like death itself, like something so pleasurable can actually kind of morph into something a little bit frightening as well, something a little bit like you're exploring something that you're not supposed to be exploring.
You see that in the ease in which laughter and tears can be interchanged, right? You see that with children, they can switch from laughter to tears in no time, and you can laugh so hard that you cry. And it's often, too, when you're crying about something sorrowful that someone can say something funny and it'll switch to laughter. That's all way down at the level of instinct, right? Where these...
Right.
It's so interesting to see the opposites touch at that level.
Yeah. So the reason why I'm doing the Eleusinian mysteries, just to bring that back, is I have a chapter on pagan religions, on what I call the pagan sublime. And I'm trying to tell the reader that we don't have the right conception of ancient religions. They're actually very different from what we think. We have these kind of cliched notions of kind of mischievous gods cavorting in clouds and doing all kinds of naughty things that are very human, and just kind of almost a silliness to it, like, whoa, we're so beyond that. But actually, pagan religions were extremely serious, and they were based on creating, go away, Siri. And they were based on creating very powerful emotional responses in people. And that was what primal religion was about, or ancient religion was about. It wasn't based on texts, on dogma, on the written word. So the Eleusinian mysteries, because they're mysteries, because nobody ever wrote about it, there's no text, there's nothing written that we can go to. Yes, there's the hymn to Demeter that kind of maybe describes a little bit of what it's based on, but we don't know really what happened because nothing was ever written down. It was simply about creating this overwhelming emotional reaction in which you took the initiates to the edge of death. You made them experience death in life. which is the story of Demeter and Persephone. We were like making them feel as if they had gone into the underworld itself, and that created a whole new relationship to life. But I wanted this idea that religion isn't this kind of milquetoasty thing that people think about nowadays. It was initially an extremely powerful reaction to human vulnerability, to our weakness in this immense cosmos with all of these very powerful forces. And the religious rituals were to actually mirror that and give you a kind of compensatory sense that you could control it, you could contain it within these kind of powerful experiences.
No, it's really interesting to me that, you've come through your analysis of the darkness, and then a consequence of that was to be motivated to pursue the sublime. It's in the little stamp that I'm using for these kids' book, which I'm doing with this illustrator named Juliette Fogra, who's a real genius in my estimation. We made a stamp, and the motto on the stamp is "Through the darkness into the light." And,
wow.
And there's this old idea that if you look into the darkness enough, you'll find something that compensates for it, right? That emerges out of the darkness, that's greater and more powerful than the darkness. And that part of the looking into the dark side of yourself is you find the power that enables you to deal with mortality. And there is something sublime about that. It's so cool that, all your work investigating and trying to integrate the shadow has led you to this what that your intuition has been gripped by the idea of the sublime. It isn't necessarily where you'd think you'd end up.
Well, a lot of the impetus for the book is another little bit of anger as well. So I always have to have some anger in order to feel the impulse to write and to discipline myself. And my anger now is about how people's worlds have become so tight and so banal and so limited, where they're just kind of disappearing into their phones, and their world is just sort of programmed for them by Facebook or social media, and they're sort of told what they're supposed to think, and they're kind of programmed. And at the same time, what science is discovering about the universe and about where we live and about who we are is just so insanely mind-blowing. It's just absolutely it's sublime in my opinion. And yet so many people are just living like as if they're sleepwalking, as if that, I talk in one chapter about the unlikeliness of any of us being alive, any of us actually being here right now on Earth, and how just to be who we are, the odds against it are like 8 trillion to 1. I mean, even more than that. But people aren't thinking about this. They're not aware of the awesomeness of just the fact of being alive, of the cosmos as it evolved, as things on Earth evolve the way they are. And so I'm kind of angry a little bit about how people are just not aware of this.
That anger again. That one of the things I did as a clinician is to help people find their purpose was to help them find out what they're angry about. It's like, well, what's your problem? You say that to someone, what's your problem? But actually you want to know. It's like, because if you have a problem, then, because there's lots of things you could be bothered about, but you're not bothered about by all of them.
Right.
There's something that stands out for you as, something that violates your sense of moral propriety, let's say. That's your problem. You think, well, I don't want to have a problem. It's, yes, you do. You want to have your problem, and then you want to go try to solve it. And if you're looking for meaning in your life, it's like, well, what bugs you? Well, I'm annoyed at this and that. And it's pretty naive and low resolution and formulaic to begin with, but you could zero right in on that, and then you find the purpose of your life. And that's it. That's in that anger. It's in that anger, at least to some degree.
Yeah, and as I said, I can't write without it. I don't know why. Every day I have to feel a little bit of pinch of it, or like a little bit of edge of that knife in me. And sometimes,
well, you have to be. That's right. I mean, I find when I'm sitting down to write a chapter, because it's hard to sit down and write a chapter. It's a lot of work, man. And, writers always whine about that, but it is hard to do. It's hard to do. It's as hard as clinical work, which is the hardest work I ever did. And so, but I have to be. It's like, there has to be a reason for this, to get me going to do it. It has to be important, and that means it has to be dealing with something weighty. And if it's weighty, it's gonna call out of you all your emotional responses, including certainly including anger. Certainly that's a tremendous form of energy.
Well, I don't know if you have the same experience, but I read so many books for my research, etc. And that's the main thing that I fault them with. There's no kind of energy behind it. There's no human behind it. There's no voice that's kind of screaming out why they have to say
right.
this.
Screaming out is exactly right. That's a great book, Screams. Like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. That's like 3,000 pages of screaming anger. It's like you sustain screaming anger for 3,000 pages. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's like being caught in a windstorm reading that book.
Yeah.
And that's no wonder that greatness is terrifying.
Yeah, and that's kind of channeling the dark side in some ways. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, I mean, that man brought down a totalitarian state, at least in part. It's like you have to have a lot of force, and you think that there's not going to be anger in part to push back against. That's all that kind of petty tyranny that you were talking about in its most, what would you say, most rigidified and universal form. And one man, who decided he was going to tell the truth and harnessed that passion to his words, changed the world.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'll have that kind of effect. I'm sure I won't. But that's sort of, I want people to, I kind of want to spark a sense of almost the religious awe without an organized religion behind it. Because I think we have changed a lot in thousands of years, but there's something in our nature that kind of craves those kinds of experiences, and nothing in our culture is providing it.
It's the definition of crave. I don't think nothing. Music does.
Yeah.
Music does, man. Music does. And that music was such a mystery for me when I was a young psychologist. Like, music is meaningful, and you can't argue the meaning away. Like, it's invulnerable to criticism. Isn't that so cool that there's a source of meaning that's invulnerable to criticism? And then it's this harmonious interplay of beautiful patterns, predictability and unpredictability, and the integration of passion and movement, right? Because it compels movement. Think of people dancing to a Strauss waltz, right? They're harmonizing themselves with the sublime patterns of the world. That's music.
Right.
It's something, man. And it's no wonder young people are so desperate for music, because that's where we have the sublime in our culture.
Well, that's where they go to things like raves or astral worlds and concerts like that. They want that kind of collective experience, that you used to get from like initiation rituals or kind of things in pagan times. I remember once I was in Nicaragua. I was a journalist. I was covering the revolution, the civil war going on. And the Pope was visiting Nicaragua at the time. It's 1984, I believe. And there was like 100,000 people crammed in this one square. And, I'm not by any means a Sandinista. I have no sympathy for it, particularly as it is now. But the feeling was that I've never experienced anything else like it, of that crowd and that group emotion. It can be frightening, too.
We can think about like... Well, that's it. That's the thing. The Nazis were unbelievably good at bringing that up, right? And so you might say, too, that if we can't figure out how to harness that force in a positive way in our culture, we pretend it doesn't exist. It's going to come up in these underground ways because the craving for it is so deep. And the Nazis were masters of spectacle and fire. They were really good at that sort of thing. And Orwell was courageous enough to point that out. He said, well, we don't have anything with that power to combat that terrible, dramatic evil. But you do see it in a concert. You do see it in that collective. Well, you said you saw it in relationship to the Pope, and hopefully that's something good. Or at least it's certainly a lot better than Nuremberg.
Yeah.
And to think that we don't need that, or that's just superstition, that's extraordinarily naive. Yeah.
I know. I agree. Yeah.
Well, look, it was really good talking with you, man.
Very nice talking to you. I really enjoyed it. These are things I never get to cover in all of my hundreds of interviews, so I'm very, very grateful for it. I've explored territory that I've never explored before, so thank you.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah. Unusual experience for me.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, man. Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Your Maps of Meaning was a very important book for me. I read it actually to help me with my war book, believe it or not. Your notion of conflict and integrating internal conflict and external conflict. So I just want to thank you and let you know nobody knows about that because I haven't really spoken about it, but that book was very important for me.
Well, thank you. I'm amazed you read it. It's a hell of a slog, that book.
700 pages, and I can't honestly say I don't think I understood everything in it, at least at the time, but it was a very amazing book.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that. And it took me, I wrote that book. It took a lot of anger, man. I wrote that book every day, 3 hours a day, every day for 15 years.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
I had to put my hands around my neck and say, God damn it, you sit down and write this goddamn book. I had to quit drinking. I had to quit having fun.
I know, believe me, I know all about that. It took me 5 years to write my last book. I can't imagine what 13 years would be like. But yeah, I know all about that.
Well, good luck with your book on the Sublime. I'm looking forward to it. Let's talk again.
Thank you very much.
Let's talk again when we want to, but maybe when it comes out, that would be good. I really like and I'm really curious about how you integrate your investigation of the Eleusinian mysteries. I talked to some interesting people about that recently.
I know. I had already written the piece when I heard them speak, and then I changed some things because I realized some things I'd written were inaccurate. But what I try to do in that is I create a character, a woman who's going to the mysteries and what it was like from her first person account. It's fictional, but I'm trying to actually, give her a history during the plague in the 1420s, and then go into the mysteries and what it would feel like subjectively to be in there.
Yeah, I had a vision once that the shamanic experience was an antidote to icy northern totalitarianism. So many people are going to the jungle now, to the Amazon, to use ayahuasca and that sort of thing. And that drug use, that hallucinogenic drug use, was tied up with those primordial religions in some profound way. We don't understand any of that even a little bit.
No. And of course, the Eleusinian mysteries probably had that drug element as well, because the drink they had was either mushrooms or ergot or opium, poppy seeds, poppy. So it's been demonstrated that all kind of pagan cultures had some kind of drug thing going on, and so.
All right, well, good luck to you writing this book.
Thank you.
And it was a pleasure talking to you, and I certainly am much more clear about everything that you've been doing. I'm so glad I decided to talk to you.
Me too. I hope I brought a little bit of clarity there.
Oh, absolutely. And it was a really good discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And say hello to your daughter for me.
I will do that, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, she's a big fan, and so is my producer, Eric.
Oh, Eric?
Yes.
Is this Eric?
Yes, this Eric.
Oh, I had no idea.
Hey, Eric, you can come in now if you want.
Yeah, big fan. Big
Yeah, well, I was all shorted out when I was reading the Daily Laws. I thought, I don't know what to do with this. It's like, it's this, what the hell's going on here? And Eric, he said, well, he really liked your books, and my daughter really liked your interview. And I thought, well, I'm obviously missing something, and I didn't spend as much time when I was deciding about this conversation reading it but I had some sense that maybe you were doing a shadow investigation, but I wasn't clear about it. So, but they were big defenders of you. It's like,
that's good.
I'm going to talk to him.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Course. Yeah, of course.
Anything I can do for you, thank you.
No,
Eric, why were these books helpful to you?
Oh man, fuck. Good question. That's tough. There's been a few points in my life where, so I was a fighter. That was my first career choice. I was a mixed martial arts fighter. And so to me, knowing, like from reading the 48 Laws of Power, it's very similar to jiu-jitsu. So when I got into business, it was like, oh, I've seen this behavior before because I've read this book and I understand this. So it started as like a very interesting, it started just as an interest, like, oh, this seems cool. I think I saw you on Tim Ferriss's show or something like that. And when I started to see those things come into play, it then like completely hooked me, and I got all the rest of the books. And
so it prepared you.
Yes, yeah, and one of the things, Robert, that I like so much about what you're doing is you're taking these principles, you're showing it throughout history, and you're giving examples of how this plays out today. And so it's like across the entire spectrum of what type of thinker is reading it. You know, you have to be the type of thinker that's going to read, which isn't everybody, but across that spectrum, everybody gets a little exactly what they need to hear in it. So it makes it very practical. You can then go off and be very practical with it. The same thing that you do.
Well, it's really important. Like, one of the things you learn as a cognitive behavioral psychologist is that you have to nail this down to changeable behavior. One of the things I was always doing with my clients was, and I've recommended this to people many times in my lectures, is find the largest unit of change that you're actually willing to do. Like, maybe you won't clean up your room. I stress that. It's like, well, will you move one thing off your desk today? One thing, just one. Or if you can't do that, because sometimes clients would come back and say, I couldn't even move one thing. I said, well, why don't you look at one thing and think about moving it? And they're embarrassed because, they're so unable to perform this task, which is a simple task. They're ashamed to admit where they are to themselves, but they can't move forward. I had one client, this is so funny. He lived at home with his mother, and he shouldn't. He was too old for that. And his room was a complete bloody catastrophe, and he knew it. And he was probably mad at his mother for, coddling him. And so he needed to vacuum the carpet. So the deal for the week was, you go vacuum that carpet. And he brought the vacuum cleaner into his room, but he left it in the doorway, on a slant. And every day for a week, he had to walk over that vacuum cleaner. He wouldn't put it back, and he wouldn't bring it in his room and vacuum. And that's a good example of that underground resentment. Just think how angry you have to be at your situation to put a vacuum cleaner. It's probably a middle finger to me, too. It's like, I'm not doing what that goddamn therapist says, that kind of resentment. But he literally walked over that damn vacuum cleaner for a week. And we talked a bunch about that. It's like, well, what are you doing? It's like, obviously you're angry. Like, why can't you do this? What are you angry about? Well, man, he was angry about plenty of things. Let's put it that way. So, there's that practicality that's real necessary to nail the highest to the lowest, and to get all that organized all the way down to practical, implementable behavior.
Are you familiar with the work of Milton Erickson?
Yes. What are you referring to specifically?
All of his work, I'm just enamored with his work, because his ability to create change, his patience, and the strategies he would employ, I just think are so brilliant. I don't know if he's respected in the field or not anymore, but I just thought his story.
Well, my experience with all those great clinicians was, you're a fool if you don't take what they knew seriously. I mean, those people had a reputation for a reason. And there's, I really learned a lot from the great behaviorists. I learned a lot from the psychoanalysts, from the Rogerian types. Like, they all had something to say. The behaviorists were great at decomposing something complex into implementable units, man. And the psychoanalysts were great at high-level conceptualization, archetypal analysis, the big story, big picture. So, hey, Eric, maybe we'll keep that discussion with you in the video.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that, dude. Yeah.
Sorry for cursing right away.
No, that's all right.
Good. That was perfect.
Once upon a time, Amazon Music met audiobooks, and listeners everywhere rejoiced.
Oh, yeah.
Because now they could listen to one audiobook title a month from an enormous library of popular audiobook titles, including romantasy, autobiographies, true crime, and more. Suddenly, listeners didn't mind sitting in traffic or even missing their flight. Amazon Music Unlimited now includes Audible. No way. Download the Amazon Music app now to start listening. Terms apply.
Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out!
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night! All day!
Hey! Oh! Little Bo Peep. She needed the money.
Oh!
Oh! Remember how great that was, man?
Oh, yeah. When I first met him, it was like one of those weird things where, I mean, you've met a lot of famous people. Some of them, you meet them, you're like, fucking really?
Bummer.
It's weird. Oh, there's bummer,
right,
too,
sorry,
yeah. The bummer ones, that sucks. When you meet someone, they suck. You're like, oh, no, you suck.
I know, exactly.
Some people just not talk. They should only do what they do. Act and sing.
But then you get to know them. Like, I don't know, like, I'm pretty good at this now, where you see people that you like looked up to. Like Eddie Vedder, I had a pretty close relationship.
Oh,
with
really?
Vedder. Yeah, but I was drinking, and then I would grab his balls and do shit like that. And then it was like, I don't want him around. I don't want Josh around.
Yeah.
I don't like that anymore. I don't want and I think Sean Penn appreciated shit like that. Like, wow, somebody has the balls. It's not even a little chaos. It's like somebody has the balls to like call me on my shit. Like, not everybody's afraid of me.
Oh, right. Yeah, he's probably used to people constantly being afraid of him.
Like, oh, we can't fuck with him.
Right. Well, he does wild.
In the same process, well, that's human being, the creative birds, and the great romantic, say, mixed process.
Orwell, you can take a lot of writers and really dig in on singular sentences.
Yeah, well, those are the great writers, because the greatest writers, I don't know if there's anything that...
Oh, boy, that was across the political spectrum. The point is, you see every side of every story, and you come to your own conclusion. Everything that I think is criticized almost to a cliche degree about the mainstream media, or what do we call it? The heterodox media? I don't know. All the people that are kind of talking through the anti-establishment, almost conspiratorial kind of quote-unquote news. All of that is not present in ground news. I do think, for me at least personally, consuming news is so much more about protecting my brain from the assault of sort of talking points and all the resilient puzzles. They're fascinating, actually amazing. Happy, and I just keep doing the thing that makes me happy. It's kind of element.couple. There's some element of the contradictions, the tensions, the drama, the way you like lock in on an idea, but then are struggling with that idea. All of that feels like it's a Nietzschean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he's a big influence on me, stylistically and like in terms of the way I approached writing. And also many of the people that were other influences of mine were very influenced by him. So I was blown away when I first came across his writings. They're so intellectually dense that I don't know if there's anything that approximates that. Dostoevsky maybe, although he's much more wordy. Nietzsche is very succinct, partly because he was so ill, because he would think all day. He couldn't spend a lot of time writing. And he condensed his writings into very short, this aphoristic style he had. And it's really something to strive for. And then he's also an exciting writer, like Dostoevsky, and dynamic and romantic in that emotional way. And so it's really something. And I really enjoyed doing that. I did that lecture that you described. That lecture series is on the first half of Beyond Good and Evil, which is a stunning book. And that was really fun to take pieces of it and then to describe what they mean and how they've echoed across the decades since he wrote them. And yeah, it's been great.
Taking each sentence seriously and deconstructing it and really struggling with it. I think underpinning that approach to writing requires deep respect for the person. I think if we approach writing with that kind of respect, you can take Orwell, you can take a lot of writers and really dig in on singular sentences.
Yeah, well, those are the great writers, because the greatest writers, virtually everything they wrote is worth attending to. And I think Nietzsche is in some ways the ultimate exemplar of that, because often when I read a book, I'll mark one way or another. I often fold the corner of the page over to indicate something that I've found that's worth remembering. I couldn't do that with a book like Beyond Good and Evil, because every page ends up marked. And that's in marked contrast, so to speak, to many of the books I read now, where it's quite frequently now that I'll read a book and there won't be an idea in it that I haven't come across before. And with a thinker like Nietzsche, that's just not the case at the sentence level. And I don't think there's anyone that I know of who did that to a greater extent than he did. So there's other people whose thought is of equivalent value. I've returned recently, and I'm going to do a course to the work of this Romanian historian of religions, Mircea Eliade, who's not nearly as well known as he should be, and whose work, by the way, is a real antidote to the postmodern, nihilistic, Marxist stream of literary interpretation that the universities as a whole have adopted. And Iliad is like that too. I used this book called The Sacred and the Profane quite extensively in a book that I'm releasing in mid-November, We Who Wrestle with God, and it's of the same sort. It's endlessly analyzable. I mean, Iliad had walked through the whole history of religious ideas, and he had the intellect that enabled him to do that, and everything he wrote is dreamlike in its density. So every sentence or paragraph is evocative in an image-rich manner, and that also, what would you say, deepens and broadens the scope, and that's part of often what distinguishes writing that has a literary end from writing that's more merely technical. Like the literary writings have this imagistic and dreamlike reference space around them, and it takes a long time to turn a complex image into something semantic. And so if your writing evokes deep imagery, it has a depth that can't be captured merely in words. And the great romantic poetic philosophers, Nietzsche is a very good example, Dostoevsky is a good example, so is Mircea Eliade, they have that quality. And it's a good way of thinking about it. You know, it's kind of interesting from the perspective of technical analysis of intelligence. There's a good book called The User Illusion, which is the best book on consciousness that I ever read. It explains the manner in which our communication is understandable in this manner. So imagine that when you're communicating something, you're trying to change the way that your target audience perceives and acts in the world. So that's an embodied issue. But you're using words which aren't equivalent to the actions themselves. Just imagine that the words are surrounded by a cloud of images that they evoke, and that the images can be translated into actions. Yeah, and the greatest writing uses words in a manner that evokes images that profoundly affects perception and action. And so I would take the manner in which I act and behave, I would translate that into a set of images. My dreams do that for me, for example. Then I compress them into words. I toss you the words, you decompose them, decompress them into the images and then into the actions, and that's what happens in a meaningful conversation. It's a very good way of understanding how we communicate linguistically.
So if the words spring to the full visual complexity, and then that can then transform itself into action.
Yes, and change in perception. Because
change in perception.
Well, those are both relevant, and it's an important thing to understand, because the classic empiricists make the presumption, and it's an erroneous presumption, that perception is a value-free enterprise. And they assume that partly because they think of perception as something passive. You know, you just turn your head and you look at the world and there it is. It's like, perception is not passive. There is no perception without action, ever. And that's a weird thing to understand, because even when you're looking at something, like your eyes are moving back and forth, if they ever stop moving for a tenth of a second, you stop being able to see. So your eyes are jiggling back and forth just to keep them active. And then there's involuntary movements of your eyes, and then there's voluntary movements of your eyes. Like what you're doing with your eyes is very much like what a blind person would do if they were feeling out the contours of an object. You're sampling, and you're only sampling a small element of the space that's in front of you, and the element that you choose to sample is dependent on your aims and your goals, so it's value saturated. And so all your perceptions are action predicated, and partly what you're doing when you're communicating is therefore not only changing people's actions, let's say, but you're also changing the strategy that they use to perceive. And so you change the way the world reveals itself for them. See, this is why it's such a profound experience to read a particularly deep thinker, because you could also think of your perceptions as the axioms of your thought. That's a good way of thinking about it. A perception is like what would you say? It's a thought that's so set in concrete that you now see it rather than conceptualize it. A really profound thinker changes the way you perceive the world. That's way deeper than just how you think about it or how you feel about it.
What about not just profound thinkers, but thinkers that deliver a powerful idea? For example, utopian ideas of Marx, or utopian ideas, you could say dystopian ideas of Hitler. Those ideas are powerful, and they can saturate all your perception with values, and they focus you in a way where there's only a certain set of actions.
Yeah, right. Even a certain set of emotions as well.
And it's intense and it's direct, and they're so powerful that they completely alter the perception, and the words spring to life.
Yeah, it's like a form of possession. So there's two things you need to understand to make that clear. The first issue is that, as we suggested or implied, that perception is action predicated, but action is goal predicated, right? You act towards a goal. And these propagandistic thinkers that you described, they attempt to unify all possible goals into a coherent singularity. And there's advantages of that. There's the advantage of simplicity, for example, which is a major advantage. And there's also the advantage of motivation, right? So if you provide people with a simple manner of integrating all their actions, you decrease their anxiety and you increase their motivation. That can be a good thing if the unifying idea that you put forward is valid, but it's the worst of all possible ideas if you put forward an invalid unifying idea. And then you might say, well, how do you distinguish between a valid unifying idea and an invalid unifying idea? Now, Nietzsche was very interested in that, and I don't think he got that exactly right. But the postmodernists, for example, especially the ones, and this is most of them with a neo-Marxist bent, their presumption is that the fundamental unifying idea is power, that everything's about compulsion and force, essentially, and that that's the only true unifying ethos of mankind, which is, I don't know if there's a worse idea than that. I mean, there are ideas that are potentially as dangerous. The nihilistic idea is pretty dangerous, although it's more of a disintegrating notion than a unifying idea. The hedonistic idea that you live for pleasure, for example, that's also very dangerous. But if you wanted to go for sheer pathology, the notion that, and this is Foucault in a nutshell, and Marx for that matter, that power rules everything, not only is that a terrible unifying idea, but it fully justifies your own use of power. And I don't mean the power Nietzsche talks about. His will to power was more his insistence that a human being is an expression of will rather than a mechanism of self-protection and security. Like, he thought of the life force in human beings as something that strived not to protect itself, but to exhaust itself in being and becoming. It's like an upward oriented motivational drive even towards meaning. Now, he called it the will to power, and that had some unfortunate consequences. At least that's how it's translated. But he didn't mean the power motivation that people like Foucault or Marx became so hung up on.
So it's not power like you're trying to destroy the other. It's power, full flourishing of a human being, the creative force of a human being.
Yeah. Well,
way.
You can imagine that, and you could imagine that you could segregate competence and ability. Like, imagine that you and I were going to work on a project. We could organize our project in relationship to the ambition that we wanted to attain, and we can organize an agreement so that you were committed to the project voluntarily, and so that I was committed to the project voluntarily. So that means that we would actually be united in our perceptions and our actions by the motivation of something approximating voluntary play. Now, you could also imagine another situation where I said, here's our goal, and you better help me or I'm going to kill your family. Well, the probability is that you would be quite motivated to undertake my bidding. And so then you might say, well, that's how the world works. It's power and compulsion. But the truth of the matter is that you can force people to see things your way, let's say, but it's nowhere near as good a strategy, even practically, than the strategy that would be associated with something like voluntary joint agreement of pattern of movement strategy towards a goal. See, this is such an important thing to understand because it helps you start to understand the distinction between a unifying force that's based on power and compulsion and one that is much more in keeping, I would say, with the ethos that governs Western societies, free Western societies. There's really a qualitative difference, and it's not some morally relativistic illusion.
So if we just look at the nuance of Nietzsche's thought, the idea he first introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, of the Übermensch.
Yeah.
It's another one that's very easy to misinterpret because it sounds awfully a lot like it's about power.
Yeah, right.
For example, in the 20th century, it was misrepresented and co-opted by Hitler to advocate for the extermination of the inferior non-Aryan races.
Yeah, and the dominion of the superior Aryans. Yeah, and that was partly because Nietzsche's work also was misrepresented by his sister after his death. But I also think that there's a fundamental flaw in that Nietzschean conceptualization. So Nietzsche, of course, famously announced the death of God, but he did that in a manner that was accompanied by dire warnings, like Nietzsche said, because people tend to think of that as a triumphalist statement, but Nietzsche actually said that, he really said something like, the unifying ethos under which we've organized ourselves psychologically and socially has now been fatally undermined by the rationalist proclivity, by the empiricist proclivity. There's a variety of reasons. Mostly it was conflict between the Enlightenment view, let's say, and the classic religious view, and that there will be dire consequences for that. And Nietzsche knew, like Dostoevsky knew, that, see, there's a proclivity for the human psyche and for human societies to move towards something approximating a unity, because the cost of disunity is high. Fractionation of your goals, so that means you're less motivated to move forward than you might be because there's many things competing for your attention, and also anxiety, because anxiety actually signals something like goal conflict. So there's an inescapable proclivity of value systems to unite. Now, if you kill the thing that's uniting them, that's the death of God, they either fractionate and you get confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness, or you get social disunity, or something else arises out of the abyss to constitute that unifying force. And Nietzsche said specifically that he believed that one of those manifestations would be that of communism, and that would kill, he said this in Will to Power, that would kill tens of millions of people in the upcoming 20th century. Like he could see that coming 50 years earlier. Dostoevsky did the same thing in his book, The Demons. So this is the thing that the a-religious have to contend with. It's a real conundrum because, I mean, you could dispute the idea that our value systems tend towards a unity, and society does as well, because otherwise we're disunified. But the cost of that disunity, as I said, is goal confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness. So it's like a real cost. So you could dispense with the notion of unity altogether, and the postmodernists did that to some degree. But they pulled off a sleight of hand too, where they replaced it by power. Now Nietzsche he's responsible for that to some degree, because Nietzsche said, with his conception of the overman, let's say, is that human beings would have to create their own values, because the value structure that had descended from on high was now shunted aside. But there's a major problem with that. Many major problems. The psychoanalysts were the first people who really figured this out after Nietzsche, because imagine that we don't have a relationship with the transcendental anymore that orients us. Okay, now we have to turn to ourselves. Okay, now if we were a unity, a clear unity within ourselves, let's say, then we could turn to ourselves for that discovery. But if we're a fractionated plurality internally, then when we turn to ourselves, we turn to a fractionated plurality. Well, that was Freud's observation. It's like, well, how can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house? Like you're a war of competing motivations. Or maybe you're someone who's dominated by the will to force and compulsion. And so why do you think that you can rely on yourself as the source of values? And why do you think you're wise enough to consult with yourself to find out what those values are or what they should be, say, in the course of a single life? I mean, you know, it's difficult to organize your own personal relationship, like one relationship in the course of your life, let alone to try to imagine that out of whole cloth you could construct an ethos that would be psychologically and socially stabilizing and last over the long run. It's like, and of course Marx, people like that, the people who reduce human motivation to a single axis, they had the intellectual hubris to imagine that they could do that. Postmodernists are a good example of that as well.
Okay, but if we lay on the table religion, communism, Nazism, they are all unifying ethos. They're unifying ideas, but they're also horribly dividing ideas. They both unify and divide. Religion has also divided people.
Yeah.
Because in the nuances of how the different peoples wrestle with God, they have come to different conclusions, and then they use those conclusions, and perhaps the people in power use those conclusions to then start wars, to start hatred, to divide.
Yeah, well, it's one of the key sub-themes in the Gospels is the sub-theme of the Pharisees. And so the fundamental enemies of Christ in the Gospels are the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. So what does that mean? The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. The scribes are academics who worship their own intellect. And the lawyers are the legal minds who use the law as a weapon. And so they're the enemy of the Redeemer. That's a subplot in the gospel stories. And that actually all means something. The Pharisaic problem is that the best of all possible ideas can be used by the worst actors in the worst possible way. And maybe this is an existential conundrum, is that the most evil people use the best possible ideas to the worst possible ends. And then you have the conundrum of how do you separate out, let's say, the genuine religious people from those who use the religious enterprise only for their own machinations. We're seeing this happen online. Like, one of the things that you're seeing happening online, I'm sure you've noticed this, especially on the right-wing psychopathic troll side of the distribution, is the weaponization of a certain form of Christian ideation. And that's often marked, at least online, by the presence of, what would you say, cliches like Christ is king, which has a certain religious meaning, but a completely different meaning in this sphere of emerging right-wing pathology. Right-wing. The political dimension isn't the right dimension of analysis, but it's definitely the case that the best possible ideas can be used for the worst possible purposes. And that also brings up another specter, which is like, well, is there any reliable and valid way of distinguishing truly beneficial unifying ideas from those that are pathological? And so that's another thing that I tried to detail out in these lectures, but also in this new book. It's like, how do you tell the good actors from the bad actors at the most fundamental level of analysis?
And good ideas from the bad ideas, and you lecture on truth that Nietzsche also struggled with. So how do you know that communism is a bad idea versus it's a good idea implemented by bad actors?
Right. That's a more subtle variant of the religious problem, and that's what the communists say all the time. The modern day communists, like, real communism has never been tried. And you could say, I suppose, with some justification, you could say that real Christianity has never been tried because we always fall short of the ideal mark. And so, I mean, my rejoinder to the communists is something like, every single time it's been implemented, wherever it's been implemented, regardless of the culture and the background of the people who've implemented it, it's had exactly the same catastrophic consequences. It's like, I don't know how many examples you need of that, but I believe we've generated sufficient examples so that that case is basically resolved. Now, the general rejoinder to that is, it's really something like, well, if I was in charge of the communist enterprise, the utopia would have come about, right? But that's also a form of dangerous pretense. Part of the way, see, that problem is actually resolved to some degree in the developing notion of sacrifice that emerges in the Western canon over thousands and thousands of years. So one of the suggestions, for example, and this is something exemplified in the Passion story, is that you can tell the valid holder of an idea because that holder will take the responsibility for the consequences of his idea onto himself. And that's why, for example, you see one way of conceptualizing Christ in the gospel story is as the ultimate sacrifice to God. So you might ask, well, what's the ultimate sacrifice? And there are variants of an answer to that. One form of ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of a child, the offering of a child, and the other is the offering of the self. And the story of Christ brings both of those together because he's the Son of God that's offered to God. And so it's an archetypal resolution of that tension between ultimate sacrifice. Ultimate because once you're a parent, most parents would rather sacrifice themselves than their children, right? So you have something that becomes of even more value than yourself. But the sacrifice of self is also a very high order level of sacrifice. Christ is an archetype of the pattern of being that's predicated on the decision to offer everything up to the highest value, right? That pattern of self-sacrifice. And I think part of the reason that's valid is because the person who undertakes to do that pays the price themselves. It's not externalized. They're not trying to change anyone else, except maybe by example. It's your problem. Like Solzhenitsyn pointed that out too, when he was struggling with the idea of good versus evil. And you see this in more sophisticated literature, in really unsophisticated literature or drama. There's a good guy and the bad guy, and the good guy's all good, and the bad guy's all bad. And in more sophisticated literature, the good and bad are abstracted. You can think of them as spirits, and then those spirits possess all the characters in the complex drama to a greater or lesser degree, and that battle is fought out both socially and internally. In the high order religious conceptualizations in the West, if they culminate, let's say, in the Christian story, the notion is that battle between good and evil is fundamentally played out as an internal drama.
Yeah, so for a religious ethos, the battle between good and evil is fought within each individual human heart.
Right, it's your moral duty to constrain evil within yourself. And well, there's more to it than that, because there's also the insistence that if you do that, that makes you the most effective possible, like, warrior, let's say, against evil itself in the social world. That you start with the battle that occurs within you, in the soul, let's say. The soul becomes the battleground between the forces of good and evil. The idea that there's an idea there too, which is if that battle is undertaken successfully, then it doesn't have to be played out in the social world as actual conflict, right? You can rectify the conflict internally without it having to be played out as fate, as Jung put it.
So what would you say to Nietzsche, who called Christianity the slave morality, and his critique of religion?